Welcome to Blueprints, Eve. Can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, I'm Yves Engler, activist and author based in Montreal. That's been involved in anti-corporate globalization and anti-imperialist struggles for about 2 decades, and author of 12 books, mostly on Canadian foreign policy.
I was checking out your Wikipedia page as I do for some of the guests, and I noticed we're the same age. And I feel like such an I enjoy writing. I don't get to do it a lot, but 12 books, you're making me feel like such an underachiever. That's amazing. I read the Black Book for Canadian. I mean, most people who've studied political science, I think at this point, hopefully have read the Black Book for Canadian foreign policy. So you use a lot of the written word to get your actions across, but you say you're also involved in activism. So what type of organizing and activism, is most notable for you?
Well, over the years, I've been involved in lots of different forms of activism. Probably the most sustained was Haiti solidarity activism. We had a group, Haiti Action Montreal, and then the Canada Haiti Action Network, that for a couple of years were doing, very aggressive, spending a lot of time on opposing Canada's role after the 2004 coup in Haiti. In more recent years, I have done stuff with Solidarité Québec Haïti, which is a sort of a more recent Haiti solidarity group set up here in Montreal. And I've done lots of stuff with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute in terms of getting that off the ground. And we did a big campaign around opposing Canada's bid for a seat on the United Nations Security Council. And that was actually, unlike most activism on anything to do with foreign policy, that was a sort of short-term success. Didn't fundamentally change the policy, but we did have, I think, a positive impact in convincing other countries to vote against Canada's bid for a Security Council seat. And then I've been involved with the Disruption Network Canada, which is a sort of informal group that was set up before the pandemic, that disrupted mostly liberal ministers or the prime minister, politicians on different international issues, from Venezuela to Haiti to climate crisis to Palestine. And then over the past, I guess, much of the last year, sort of informally, we've kind of got some of that going back again.
I imagine Canadian foreign policy isn't an easy place to navigate. I mean, in Canadian politics, we can talk about different policy items somewhat cordially. There's a few hot ticket items that just bring out the worst in everyone, but generally there can be a discussion. I find Canadian foreign politics or talking about international relations a little Orwellian, right? In that clear lines have been set. There are good actors and bad actors. We're not to really question that. How things are reported on is obviously slanted that way, to that really kind of like bipolarity, A lot of it is red baiting. But when you question that and when you challenge that, that's not very popular. I imagine you face a lot of backlash. We'll talk about your tactics later, because you're talking about disrupting foreign ministers' meetings and whatnot, but just generally taking the stand that you do on Canada and making us look bad on that international stage. Do you face a lot of heat for that?
Yeah, I mean, mostly the propaganda system just ignores it, right?
Okay.
They just don't publish. Like I've written about this. I did this, detailed this pretty extensively in my 2016 book, A Propaganda System, how Canada's government, corporations, media, and academia sell war and exploitation. And I worked in the research department of the Communications Energy Paperworkers Union, which later became Unifor. And one of the things I did was I wrote op-eds on behalf of the president of the union, Dave Coles, and got, I don't know, like 15 of them over like a year period or something like that. I got like 15 of them published in the Ottawa Citizen, Toronto Star, Vancouver Sun, many, and with a really high success ratio.
Along these lines, these anti-imperialist critiques.
Entirely on domestic issues.
On labor issues.
Yeah, on labor issues, writing.
Okay, because I'm like, wow, that is really...
Some of them even calling for like economic democracy, like Ottawa Citizen published.
Okay,
like,
still radical, yeah.
It was fairly radical within the parameters of the dominant discussion.
Yeah.
And now that, of course, came with the institutional heft of a labor union. It wasn't just some individual writing it, but it was it was a stark contrast to writing on international issues, where I basically don't get published at all. And I had this personal experience going back 2 decades when I initially was writing more on domestic issues, where I actually got things published in the Globe and Mail, the Ottawa Citizen, under my own name, but on foreign policy, it's just like, I mean, I've submitted dozens and dozens, and I often tone them down to try to, make it like you have a chance to get in. And so I mostly just gave up, of course, because no point in toning something down to try to get it published in a corporate outlet and then not being able to. You're better off writing like what you really believe and just publishing it on your own site or on Rabble, or on Canadian Dimension, or some left-wing outlet. So my overwhelming experience is to just ignore. Now, there have been instances, I have examples of this funny one where I sent a press release about my book about Lester Pearson to the what was then Embassy magazine. Now it's all part of Hill Times, and the guy had just a total panic because the top 10 was the top 10 things what you didn't know about Lester Pearson, and number 1 was that Chomsky considers Lester Pearson a war criminal. And the foreign policy guy at the embassy just sent us this email back. I don't care what Chomsky says. You besmirch Canada. How dare you? There's like really sort of...
You went on a list at that point. You know that, right?
Yeah. So,
your emails got blocked after that.
So I have had these experiences where you hit some button that goes to a sort of liberal nationalist or kind of a thinking, but overwhelmingly it's just ignore. There's not enough of a movement, there's not enough of an institutional structure behind these ideas that can kind of like put pressure on the major media outlets to even bother denying them or attacking them. And so the more sensible thing is to just ignore, so that's my overwhelming experience on the Canadian foreign policy front.
It's like there's no room for gray area, right? And there's certain countries as well that we're just like not allowed to question our stand. But then there's also that image of Canadians as peacekeepers. And I know you've written about this extensively, trying to break that narrative up, right, with facts. And I'm wondering, do you think people are still holding on to that to the level that they did back when we named the airport after Pearson, when we thought peacekeeping was, like, if you ask people for quite some time what they were proud of Canada, or what made Canada unique and the best. And I'm an anti-nationalist, so I don't enjoy saying any of this back. But they would have said our peacekeeping mission, right? That was often pointed to as like, yeah, our defining kind of approach. That was problematic in its own, right? Like we don't have time to get into the actual peacekeeping mission, but that seems to have gone by the wayside. Like we don't even have a facade of it anymore. So is that breaking down in the Canadian public's mind, or?
I think the specific idea of peacekeeping has broken down significantly. The Trudeau government sort of dabbled in some of that before the 2015 election, and then a little bit after, but mostly has just left that, just dropped the peacekeeping issue. So, and I think that, if it's not reinforced by the government, and if it's not reinforced by elements of the propaganda apparatus, then the population tends to let it go. I think what the peacekeeping spoke to, there's two sides to it. I think it spoke to a positive element in the kind of Canadian psyche of wanting to end conflict around the world. There's a sort of positive element to that. And then I think that spoke to just being bamboozled by
You're very generous there.
yeah, by what peacekeeping really was. Now, what I think there has happened, the sort of anti-war movement and probably the anti-imperialist movement is at a very low ebb.
Really?
At this point in 20.
No, you're not supposed to come on here and say that.
So
okay, I'll take it.
Unfortunately, that's the reality. Now, having said that, I think that I have seen within my 20 years of engaging on foreign policy issues, I think that there was a time, like around the Haiti issue, where there was a perception, even in kind of the radical left, there was this perception, which I had at the time, that Canadian history, Canadian foreign policy wasn't so bad. It was actually pretty good, and we're going kind of on the wrong trajectory. I think that's very much changed. I think there's now a much the intellectual production that's critical of Canadian foreign policy in 2022 versus in 2000. I bet you have like 10 times more articles that were published critical of Canadian foreign policy in 2022 than in 2000. It doesn't lead to much activism or much sort of power in that beyond the kind of very narrow left-wing intellectual strata, but it at least leaves some sort of basis for, from a long-term perspective, to sort of rethink and reorient Canadian foreign policy. But yeah, specifically on peacekeeping, I think it has subsided, and that's in large part because the government and the military for a long time, this is not talked about much, but the military was promoting peacekeeping as a way to justify its budget. It decided, and that's kind of what Rick Hillier in the Afghanistan and the whole speech about we're the Canadian military that kills people and we go kill the scumbags, that famous speech, that kind of was the full break away from this mythology around peacekeeping to a different kind of justification for the military.
Well, the cat was out of the bag there, I guess. There was no going and putting that one back. But the activism that's lacking, I write down to ask you, how do we get that institutional heft that you reference that we need to really push back in earnest rather than sitting and contemplating about it in a few articles? But as my mind is working, as it does, I'm going, well, how do we get people, leftists predominantly, to prioritize foreign policy over the battles that they're facing here at home? I imagine that's part of the issue, and maybe not wanting to let go, because even some leftists are incredibly nationalist and don't enjoy Canada bashing, right? Just as we're not allowed to critique the NDP, we're not really allowed to critique Canada on the world stage. Domestic policy, no problem, but yeah, that kind of permeates. But how do you envision us getting substantial pushback and to make it more of an indent, long-term successes rather than the short-term?
I don't really have a clear answer to that. I think it's just building the groups that are, that's part of what trying to set up the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute is about, is having some vehicle to not just a single issue, but sort of a general critique of Canadian foreign policy. And then, all the slew of different sort of activist groups challenging specific issues. Obviously, Palestine's the one where there's the most doing it. But I think there's a political economy to it that we have to recognize, of course, and that labor unions and the power of the boss and capital. There's a institutional structure that comes that and enables raising money and like I've said that about I talked about that again in the propaganda system book, but like the cost of one national representative of Unifor is probably the budget of like all of or half of the budget of all of the anti-war groups in the country, right? And Unifor alone has like a couple hundred national representatives, right? So we have to, be clear about that, and that so they obviously most of this stuff is entirely voluntary activism, and unlike, and I don't say this in a way to sort of like besmirch union activists, but there's lots of people who get involved in union activism who see at the end of the road there may be a job, right? They, maybe spend 5 years as a shop steward, and down the road they know there may be a job. They can, parlay that into something. In the case of, Haiti activism or even Palestine, there's like 2 or 3. Maybe Palestine is like 5 people hired, sort of full-time Palestine paid kind of people. Maybe it's 10, I don't know, but it's a very small number. So there's some of these dynamics that we have to be, honest about and recognize. They're not insurmountable. I mean, it ultimately comes down to people taking these issues seriously, and I would argue that that the main issues of the day can't really be dealt with in a national way. The climate crisis is it's by definition, it's an international issue, and we have to develop a certain amount of international solidarity to be able to deal with that. I also would argue that what we're seeing with the NATO proxy war with Russia, and quite frankly, what we're preparing for, which very likely will be even worse with a war with China, I think that it's very mistaken for leftists, environmentalists, to just sort of like, hey, we'll leave that geopolitics in the hands of the the arms companies and the militarists, and we'll just let them like take care of that domain, and we'll focus on what we'll figure out dealing with the climate crisis while we're in like war with Russia and China at the same time. I think that's a very dangerous kind of abdication, really, of our sort of political responsibility. But yeah, so it's a matter of building it on a volunteer basis, and building it by in terms of an institution like the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, trying to lots of individuals providing very small amounts of money, and having maybe making that kind of thing replicated, obviously, in many other institutes and many other issue specific campaigns.
Yeah, that seems to be a theme amongst our guests, like having to rely on crowdfunding. And that, like, it's not sad or anything. It's just like our reality, right? And versus always up against big money there. And there's so much awareness raising. Quite often we talk about issues on the show that I think we're past the point of awareness raising, like climate change, where it's like demands for calls to action. But in the case of foreign policy, because I say this, I was listening back to your latest Canadian Foreign Policy Hour that you have every Monday, and which I think is really cool, by the way. I'm going to go off on a little tangent here because I mentioned it. You're allowed to register for the hour that it's on Zoom. And so you're a part of this discussion. He has guests and panelists, so you do get a lot of information, but then it does become a part of a discussion that you can then find later on YouTube. But I thought that was a really approachable way to allow people to ask questions, because foreign policy isn't our lived experience, right? Like healthcare and like more tangible things that we can understand, like generational things even. But foreign policy is completely different. And I'm listening to your latest episode where you do talk about what's brewing with the staging area of Japan and the approach that they're taking with China and the imminent danger that lays there. And so you make a great point that, if we understand the urgency of climate change, but we do often quite seem to leave foreign policy for a small fringe of the left to really take on as a full-time focus, right? It's always hard to get leftists to focus on single issues, right? But it just seems reckless. Yeah, completely reckless, because I learned a lot in that hour. I had it going while I was in the bathtub, and I was like kind of scared, right? Like it's much easier to ignore those problems and pretend that they won't ever impact us than to deal with it head on. How do you kind of relay all the context and information that's needed for someone to understand why a certain policy is bad, because that's what foreign policy relies on, right? Like, you need to know like historical context. Like, people looking at Ukraine and Russia is a great example, whereas any previous context prior to Russia's invasion has been erased, right? We do not discuss the lead up to what had happened. We don't examine Canada's role in that, and we're almost not allowed to be honest. So, like, I don't even know if there's a question in there, Yves. I'm just kind of like processing this as I'm talking to you, but
yeah, no, I mean, it's an obstacle to how to, and it's an obstacle I do with, like, you know,
daily
my talks, right? I've I've done dozens or hundreds of these talks over the last 15 years, and you're given a talk about Canada's role in Haiti, and you don't want to. You sort of have to assume much of the room knows nothing, right? And
yeah.
so how do you give those, how do you give the background and stuff? And people have had this criticism about a thing I did in Nanaimo with this Trudeau event like 6 weeks ago or so, where the person was basically saying, you're covering too many issues. You got to give a bit more detail about each issue. And you can't just presume that the people, the 25 people who show up to the Nanaimo Public Library, that they're necessarily going to understand, they have this, some degree of background. And that's why, Justin Trudeau can, a week ago when he was in Mexico City, he can say, we're looking for Haitian-led solutions to Haiti's problems, while he's meeting, just after he meets with the U.S. president, while he's just, in Mexico City with the Mexican president. Like, it's a farce that he's, say that in general, that while he's in Mexico, but it's also a farce if you know anything about Canada's role in Haiti. But his ability to make this just completely like comical kind of statement is based upon the fact that the vast majority of Canadians know almost nothing about recent Canadian history in Haiti, or medium-term Haiti, last 20 years of Canadian role in Haiti, last 100 years of Canada's role in Haiti. So it is an obstacle, and then you do run into a thing where then you, by getting too detailed, then you sort of end up marginalizing a certain element of, and who wants to read 2,000 words about something, and who wants to listen for it. So
time is money, man.
Yeah, so time is money, exactly. But I think that's where different forms of political engagement, right? Like books are only speaking to a certain audience, and I've always said that with my book tours. I sort of see, okay, maybe like you'll do like 25 events across the country, and maybe 1,000 people will show up in person, and they'll hear the full 45-minute talk. But then, and then maybe of that, maybe, I don't know, a couple hundred will even read the book. But the whole process, like the email that announcing the event, maybe 50,000 people will read that. And then maybe during the tour, you'll, reach 50,000 people, and, a couple community radio stations, an article, maybe one article in the Peterborough Examiner, and they'll get a little idea about Canada's done bad things in Haiti. And so,
You've raised a flag at least, right?
Yeah.
And it's up to people to maybe do a little bit of digging, but we know that quite often folks don't have the time for that. But I feel bad now, because before we started recording, I imagine you cringed when I was like, okay, Yves, we might not have a lot of time to go into detail on Canadian policy. We don't have time to give it justice. So it's like, yeah, so I'll just leave the door open for folks to listen to Justin Trudeau, and he can update us on what's happening in Haiti. So let's be fair. Let's take a few moments and update folks as best you can on Haiti, because I think that's one of the items that, we certainly have a spot where we're not paying attention. And the level of arms trade. Now, there's some people who are aware that we are a big competitor in terms of the arms trade, but I don't think they understand to the extent it plays in politically. Just selling weapons to anybody, right? Whoever needs them. But it's very deliberate in our application. And I think that's where folks aren't really paying attention. So I'm going to give you some space here, and I would like to, if you could educate me a little bit on what's going on in Haiti, why we're sending weapons over there, and why that's a bad thing.
Well, we're sending weapons to Haiti, light armor vehicles for the police, basically to entrench oligarchic gangsterism. And basically, 18 months ago, we appointed, and I say we, I mean the U.S. Canada-led core group of countries that the ambassadors basically heavily influenced Haitian policy. We appointed Ariel Henry to lead the country, like literally through a tweet. The guy who leads Haiti today was put there because the U.S. and Canada tweeted that he should be there. Hard
That
to
sounds
believe,
official.
no? So yes, exactly. So and so back since 2010, the U.S. and Canada imposed the PHTK. Michel Martelly, who've been leading Haiti for the last 11 years, and they're supported by the small oligarchic families that are mostly light-skinned in a country that's almost entirely black, and they're totally tied into drug running and all kinds of criminality. And that's so we've been backing this regime for the past 11 or so years. And the next step back to that is in 2004 we overthrew the elected government, most popular politician in the history of the country, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and thousands of other elected officials. And we supported a coup government for 2 years that killed thousands of people. That brought in a UN occupation that was there for, well, sort of continues in a smaller version today, but was there for significantly for 13 years. The UN occupation brought cholera to the country because they were dumping their feces in water streams that Haitians were drinking from, and knowingly, and they continued to do it after even they brought cholera to the country. Tens of thousands died because of cholera. Basically, Haiti has been a U.S.-Canadian colony in the absolute worst sense of that for the past 2 decades, where we, if you don't have Canadian-U.S. backing, you certainly are not allowed to be leader. And when a mild reformist that took over after the coup, after we tried to rig elections in 2006, René Préval, when a mild reformist leader, they did everything they could to basically force him and his party out after 2010, so it's really brutal. If even from you can even make an argument from a capitalist perspective, it's not totally a clear-cut good strategy.
That's what, like, I hate to dumb it down, but like, why then? Why do we play this role? Like resource extraction, and when we go to South America, that becomes kind of obvious. It's evil and it's imperialist, but we understand. Like, we have mining companies and we want them to flourish, and that economic model some people support. But what's going on in Haiti that would cause us to weigh in at that level?
Well, from a capitalist perspective, Haiti has the lowest wages in the hemisphere. So that's why a company like Gildan Activewear, a Montreal apparel company, is operating Haiti, and they don't even produce the full shirt. They do the heavy stitching part, right? I hate because the electricity costs are so high in Haiti that they'll do the more electricity intensive part in the Dominican, and just the highest labor intensive part will take place in Haiti, because that's that they have these almost entirely women at very, very low wages. And so that's the capitalist perspective, and there's constant pattern of, Aristide, one of the things he did was he doubled the minimum wage, and so the Canadian government, the American government have consistently opposed efforts to increase the minimum wage. But I think that you can't understand it just from a capitalist perspective like that. It's more tied into, obviously, Canada's aligning with the U.S. and what the U.S. wants, but it's about basically Haiti is the we dominate, and in the case of Aristide, it was that he provided some degree of a good example of sort of breaking away from the grip of U.S.-led domination, and that needs to be punished. But I'd say, like, at a more macro level, is
setting an example.
In terms of setting an example, breaking away from if Haiti means nothing to global capitalism. I mean, it's
clearly
it's not even the size of, I don't know, like maybe the University of Toronto might. It's the whole budget of the University of Toronto is almost half of Haiti's entire economy or whatever, right? So But if Haiti can break away a bit, then well, next thing you know, you have Guatemala, then you start having Honduras, and then you start having Mexico, and that starts actually mattering to multinational corporations. But I think that Haiti has a specific element in that it's been punished for over 2 centuries for having probably the greatest example of liberation in the history of humanity. The Haitian Revolution defeated slavery, defeated white supremacy, colonialism over 13 years, and beat the French, British, Spanish with U.S. backing at different periods. And so there's this particular anti-Haitian. It's not just an anti-blackness. It's an anti-Haitianism as well that is really deep-seated. And we do dominate the place. So we're going to continue to dominate the place, and so long as there's not a movement in Canada or a movement in Haiti or elsewhere that's going to push back against that, so we back these interests in Haiti that I call it oligarchic gangsterism of these small handful of families that dominate the economy, and mostly by importing stuff, and who the payment for importing that stuff is Haitians that don't live in Haiti, right? It's the remittances that people living in Canada or the Haitians living in Canada, the U.S. or Chile or wherever send back, and that's what sustains the economy. And then, if you want to all the high-minded rhetoric that Canadian politicians say about defending democracy in Ukraine and defending sovereignty in the Ukraine. Spend a bit of time looking at what Canada's done in Haiti, and you'll find that it's really hard to believe that that's the objective going on in the Ukraine.
It's a label we've often given U.S. foreign policy as being very hypocritical, right? Certain countries are allowed to behave in certain ways and others are not, and some are demonized for being authoritarian, and then others are allowed to crack down without any kind of consequence. It's this vision that there's really just the U.S.'s way or the highway. But I don't think we're all that used to Canada playing such a lapdog role. I had a guest on earlier from South America, and they argued that even Stephen Harper, as awful as he was, had a more independent foreign policy than Trudeau, that it's becoming even more aligned with the interests of the United States, who we seem to inherently know are troublemakers, for the lack of a better word there. Do you agree with that statement? Is this a trend in that direction, and is it unique to Trudeau?
Unfortunately, it's not. If you look at Lester Pearson's foreign policy, I just wrote something criticizing Rick Salutin, who I know and I consider a friend, columnist of the Toronto Star. He talked about how Lester Pearson challenged U.S. war in Vietnam, and that's just absolutely factually incorrect. Lester Pearson was a big proponent of the U.S. war in Vietnam. I think that there was time, I think, with the Pierre Trudeau government where there was a bit of a independence streak that was developed. And you could say maybe with Jean Chrétien, there was obviously what he did with the Iraq War in 2003 was a sign of he didn't give the Bush administration what they wanted above all else, which was official endorsement of the coalition of the willing. He did, however, of course, provide all kinds of main support for the U.S. war in Iraq, but didn't give the main thing Bush wanted, which was the official endorsement. That was because there was the mass demonstrations, particularly the one here in Montreal, the couple here in Montreal that got to 150,000 people on some very, very cold winter days. And it was also partly tied to the fact that Quebec elections were happening, and there's some of the dynamics at play there. But I think that, if you look at the Lester Pearson policy, I think that there was time, I think, with the Pierre Trudeau government where there was a bit of a independence streak that was developed. And it was also partly tied to the fact that Quebec elections were happening, and there's some of the dynamics at play there. But I assume what the mention around Latin America is with regards to the Lima group, in that, and the Venezuelan government officials have said that, is that even Harper, who was very, hostile to Chavez and hostile to the Maduro government, it took a whole step further when Chrystia Freeland became foreign minister, and where she pushed the whole creation of the Lima group and the bid to oust the Venezuelan government through that. And a lot of that seems to have just sort of continued on even after Freeland left. I would be, very cautious about any hint at some sort of like golden age of Canadian foreign policy, where we were independent from the U.S.
There's never been one, save for kind of Iraq, where Chrétien was just allowed to walk the line a little bit. But you say that it was from like pressure in the streets. Is that what it's going to take? And when I say that, like with Iraq, it's so clear cut. It's like, don't go to war, right? Like war, no war. It's not that clear cut anymore. Not that it always was, but especially with something like Haiti, like selling arms, where it's a lot more indirect. And then, how do you mobilize continually too? Because a lot of folks don't agree with the approach that Canada's taking with Ukraine, right? That the anti-war movement is not allowed to exist in that realm at the moment. And so I'm struggling too, and I don't want to discourage anyone, but like we have to figure out what kind of approach is going to need to change the entire foreign policy, not just one war at a time, because one, that's exhausting and it's not lasting, right? We went to Afghanistan, right? And we've not really changed our tact all that much. But what was it about Iraq that brought folks to the street? And I'm saying in my mind, of all the issues that you've mentioned, Palestine has been, I think, the most successful in terms of visible resistance to that foreign policy, and that can be a slog as well. But is that resources? Is it the organizing that's done? Is there something emotional to certain countries that we will respond to and others that we just don't seem to care about? Do you have a read on the Canadian mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all of that. With regards to Iraq, I think, unfortunately, one of the elements was that the Iraq, and I know people have said that in the U.S. a lot, and it kind of, I think, flowed into Canada, was that it was actually more of an anti-George W. Bush mobilization than it was actually an anti-war mobilization.
Well, he was easy to hate.
Yeah, so it became a sort of Democrat-Republican kind of dynamic to it. So that's one element. The fact that you had Germany and France opposed, that meant they were powerful countries that are part of NATO and part of the G7 and sort of viewed as traditional allies. Yeah. That also made things easier. Also, the fact that the Iraq thing did actually play out over. I mean, there was an earlier war in Iraq that Canada was a major player in the early '90s. And so there was a certain, I think, consciousness on the Iraq and how much there had been of sort of trying to like destroy the country by the U.S. for a decade plus. On the different issues, I mean, obviously you see, a lot of people pointed out the racism with regards to the Ukraine, Russia, and prioritizing, focusing on that versus places where non-white people were the primary victims. That has some, I think, somewhat complicating dynamics to it, because people mostly didn't pay attention to the fact that there was thousands of people killed in the Donbass in an 8-year war, basically entirely white previously, because those were viewed as it was viewed as pro-Russia to worry about those people being killed.
To be honest, I'm not even sure they told us much about that, right? Like, what Canadians care about often winds down to what we get from the Star or the Globe. Not everyone.
That is the point. The point is that the media sets the agenda on international, and as you pointed out, the fact that we don't have a lived experience. When the healthcare system is when you've gone to hospital and there's, you have to wait 20 hours, or a family member or someone fairly close to you has had that experience, you sort of say, hey, there's a problem with the healthcare system. Or if you work minimum wage and the business press tells you that if you increase the minimum wage, the world's going to fall down, you're like, well, actually it might be nice to have another $1.50 an hour or whatever. But when it comes to international issues, they can just basically lie as much as they want. We have almost no ability to ground the information they're putting forward in some sort of make sense of it. So the media's power is just that much greater. It's great on all domestic issues. It's great on across the board, but it becomes even more. And on foreign policy, the range of debate is so much narrower than on domestic issues. There is a sense that there are institutions. The labor unions, for instance, is the most obvious one. They do provide some check to the power of corporations and capital on working conditions, on different labor standards, and even they engage in campaigns for Medicare. Libyans engage in a little bit of foreign policy, but mostly not. They engage in they fund different coalitions on many different domestic issues for daycare, etc. And the media's power. Now, the Palestine is I would say the one issue where there has been there is a bit of an institutional campaigning kind of structure that has developed, where there are multiple groups that have been around now for many years that have fairly significant lists, that when something happens, they're able to mobilize 1,000 people to send an email, a couple thousand people to send an email on some Palestine, and then when Israel does the worst of its violence, is able to sort of then we get these mass mobilizations where we actually get people in the street in fairly significant numbers, and that institutional structure enables pan-Canadian Day of Action or whatever. But yeah, no, it's hard. It's hard to know what the definition is, and then it becomes sort of like diaspora communities, like here in Montreal with the Haitian community. There is actually some pushback. There's some political power in pushing back on Canadian foreign policy. Now, that itself is a whole other question that got to open up about how diaspora communities get sucked into Canadian imperialism, but they are also the tend to be some of the main forces challenging Canadian imperialism as well.
I was just going to say, like, the Palestinian issue there, that's one area that labor has stepped into foreign policy to a degree. I had representatives from the Palestinian youth movement on earlier on this year, and they spoke of how many unions, particularly in Quebec, but across Canada, that had signed on to BDS or various, Palestinian causes there. And I know that there's a new movement, a new campaign out called Labor for Palestine. And so, yeah, that's, again, one exception, but you hit it right on the nail there, that it's the diaspora that plays such a huge part in mobilizing, because they do have lived experience. So that drive is there to do work beyond which some people, I think, can understand is possible, because so much is at stake versus your average settled Canadian or naturalized Canadian, who doesn't have family somewhere under siege or under occupation, right? So trying to build allies, I find, or allyship in places where they don't have a vested interest is critical. And I think like storytelling has really been successful there. But I wanted to spend, we're getting a little bit close to the end of our time, and I did want to ask you about your more traditionally disruptive activities, because I was giggling. I had forgotten, and I had seen the clip, but going through your Wikipedia page, disrupting meetings. We talked about it just briefly earlier. So much so, like, you dumped grape juice on foreign policy minister in what addressing Haiti. It was supposed to represent blood. What do you want to accomplish when you do a performative action like that? And I don't mean performative in a slight way. Like it is, it's
definitely
dramatized, right? Like it's visual. It's
no. I've had a number of times where the security said, "Okay, you've done your performance. Now it's time to leave," and I mostly agree with them and do. So I completely agree that it is it's a sort of like a stunt, a media stunt, a political stunt. They vary. The two, what you're referring to with Pierre Pettigrew was a conference on Haiti in 2005 here in Montreal, on the final press conference after this, at a day and a half long conference with ministers from the de facto coup government and many Canadian officials. And I put fake blood on. It was actually cranberry juice and some like red dye.
Oh, you really worked on it. Okay.
And we poured it on. I poured it on his hands and said, "Pettigrew lies, Haitians die" in French.
Blood on his hands.
Les Haïtiens meurent. And then we had there was other people in the room, and we had somebody who had a placard, one in French, one in English, about I think it had Pettigrew lies, Haitians die. So it was it was a media stunt designed to draw some attention to Canada's imperialistic policy in Haiti, which at that moment there were this was not any sort of abstraction. There were Canadian-backed police who were killing people regularly in Port-au-Prince and elsewhere, and to push back against that. The more the actions on the Disruption Network Canada that we started in 2019, which I've now done a few dozen of these different disruptions. They vary a bit in terms of what the sort of political intent is. Social media has changed. Like in 2005, we didn't have Twitter, and I don't know if Facebook was around, but we weren't using it at least. And it was more just hey, this is a press conference. The cameras are there. We're going to put something in front of the cameras and try to get a message.
Just kind of hope that it makes the newsreel.
Yeah, exactly.
That they don't ignore you again.
Yeah, and so, but now with social media, that dynamic has changed a little bit. Where you can, I do now. I film myself as I'm telling Yves Engler, the environment minister, that he's a climate criminal for okaying the Baie du Nord oil expansion. And some of the clips on social media get very widespread circulation, and you got to, even within the different issues, calling Guilbeault a climate criminal. You're not teaching anybody anything. I mean, most people have a sense of the climate crisis. I think you're adding a little bit of a rhetorical consciousness, taking it maybe a step further, which I think has some political value. But on some of the disruptions, you on something like I don't know, I did one on a charity that supports Israeli colonialism. I don't think most Canadians don't know that there's all these charities that the Canada Revenue Agency is subsidizing that are supporting all kinds of projects in Israel that effectively dispossess Palestinians. Or one I did, the one that got the most circulation was around Mélanie Joly, about a month into Russia's invasion, where she was speaking about, Canada's foreign minister was speaking about Ukraine, where I challenged her on the Minsk Accord on...
How do they keep letting you in?
Yeah, that's a whole other interesting question of how that dynamic plays out of getting in. And I get denied a lot.
Okay.
But there's different ways of getting in there. So, but I think that the politics of the disruptions are sort of interesting, because if there are cameras there and you think that the dominant media is going to cover it, the social media side's not that important, and you're best off getting right in front of the cameras and figuring a way of trying to generate corporate media attention. But if there aren't any cameras there, or you don't expect them, it's an issue that's the media, just like Palestine, they're not going to cover. A lot of the stuff on Haiti, they might not cover. If it's something that on Ukraine was already in the news a lot, the chance of them covering it goes up a bit. but then, so there's social media. So you're trying to get an idea out there on Twitter or Facebook around some critical idea of Canadian foreign policy, which I write articles, and I see how many people read the articles that I post on my website, and it's in the hundreds. It's definitely not into the thousands. It's definitely not in the tens of thousands, and definitely not in the hundreds of thousands. Where some of the disruptions, obviously, you're not getting as deep into the ideas, but you're giving a little bit of the idea. They actually do get watched by thousands, tens, and even hundreds of thousands of people on social media. So it's another way of getting some of the ideas out there, and then also at the really successful level, breaking into the corporate media, and sometimes that has succeeded. Like the Steve Engler one, where Climate Criminal, it got wide media attention, like 3 or 4 outlets. He was convening a press conference about something else, and their stories were entirely about the disruption and about being called a climate criminal. And even 6 months later, the Washington Post and the New York Times, when they did profiles of Guilbeault, they referenced the fact that he was called a climate criminal at the press conference. So it's a media stunt, but especially on foreign policy issues, that it's so hard to break through in the dominant media. It's I think a quite useful tool, because again, it's so difficult. Writing books there's certain people who may read a book about Canadian foreign policy, a bit bigger audience that may read an article about it, but we're talking pretty small audience, and social media and potentially even breaking into the corporate media is obviously very valuable.
Yeah, we talk on the show a lot how it takes a diverse amount of tactics and approaches. People consume information different ways. They're willing to do certain things. Like, you got to work within people's comfort zone before you push them out of it. On one hand, are you trying to also encourage people to do more?
Yeah, resistance.
Thank you. Bold actions, I guess.
Well, I think that part of what the media does with its sort of so one-sided perspective on these international issues is that there actually are more of us out there than we understand, right? They make people feel totally isolated. They make people feel that no one else cares, and so acts of resistance that people see sort of say, hey, maybe if I'm not going to go and disrupt a minister, maybe at minimum I'll forward on this article to some friends, or I'll show up at the rally next week, or so on I think a lot on the foreign policy front, particularly. There are other issues as well, but the people who sort of know, or somewhat, they feel very overwhelmed. They feel that no one else cares, whatever variation of that kind of feeling. They feel demobilized. And so you're hoping to engender some degree of pushback and create a sense that, of activity, however small and somewhat fleeting a minute disruption of a minister is.
No, that's entirely true, because those fleeting moments, you have no idea what their impact is, right? Like, whether they circle back to your website and read a more in-depth article to gain that knowledge, or, you've just at least raised one of those flags we talked about earlier. It's like you'll never really know the depth of that impact, right? But it had some. And I absolutely cringe when folks criticize different tactics in this fight, because we're all just figuring it out. There is no book on what to do. We don't know what works and what doesn't work at this point, not in the long-term sense of things. And I'm specifically, I guess, thinking of the youth and the Just Oil movement, just you talking about that disruption and how they, were throwing things on works of art that were under glass, tomato soup, right? Representing blood again. And all the condemnation that it received, or criticism for being disruptive or destructive, sparked 10 times as more discussions on what is acceptable activism, or what other tactics could we use that would be more effective, and why are they doing that, So I want to encourage you to keep doing your work, and I will continue to read it. I've registered for your next Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. I want to experience that. I'm sorry I only caught it on YouTube. I should have chimed in earlier, but thank you. We'll probably pick your brain again as we really are exploring South America. But we'll call you on there we'll have like a million questions on that and the Lima group and whatnot. But is there anything that you would like to point folks towards as we sign off here? Works that are coming down or actions that you're planning?
No, I mean, I have a website where I post my articles at some point, yvesengler.com. If people are interested in sort of keeping track of Canadian foreign policy in a fairly passive form of engagement, which is always the first step towards a more active form of engagement, I think I would invite people to get on the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute's email list. It's a list of, I think, around 15,000, and there's sort of regular webinars and some action alerts, announcements, sometimes about demonstrations, and but it's a bit of a community of people trying to challenge Canadian foreign policy. So I would invite people to check that out and get on that Canadian Foreign Policy Institute's email list.
I'll be sure to, the audience knows this, but I'll remind them that the show notes are always full of links back to the work of our guests and the things that they suggest we should read more about, because foreign policy is also fun to learn about. I'm a political nerd, so maybe that's unique, but you're always like that person at your family dinner with these did you know Canada is doing this? And there's no shortage of horrors that would really kind of challenge your family's perspective on the nationalist pride that I think plagues us to many depths. But I think that's an episode in itself, one I've been meaning to tackle. But you've kind of touched on nationalism and a whole bunch of great things here. Again, thank you so much for taking time to come on. And it was a pleasure meeting you.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.